This week, Lee Swillingham, art director of the groundbreaking Face magazine between 1993 and 1999, and the co-curator of the Face Culture Shift photographic exhibition, which opened to national acclaim at the National Portrait Gallery in London.
I was really inspired by the work of Neville Brody, who was the Face art director in the 80s. Nick called me into his office and asked me if I wanted to be the art director. And I mean, I literally, I just couldn't believe they were asking me to do it. I was like 22. I was slightly intimidated by the amazing legacy of the magazine, the Felix Howard covered where it says hard and he's got killer, and the Ray Petrie Jake. I mean, that's the best magazine cover of all time, in my opinion. And we did this fun project when Tomb Raider was the really big video game when it first came out, and I had the idea to do a fashion shoot with Lara Croft. Someone suggested us that maybe we go and see a few museums and galleries. So we put a little deck together and went to see the National Portrait Gallery. I knew one of the curators there. And we said, oh, we've got this idea. We want to do a show on the Face, probably quite a focused, small thing, but there's some like really amazing pictures that need to be seen again. And then less than a week later, they called up and said, we want to do the show. I have to be honest with you, we were more thinking about the party we were going to have.
And if you're interested in photography, fashion, and pop culture, this interview will give you some insights on its importance, on ideas and where to get them, on risk, and on celebrity. Now, just time, though, to ask you to like, subscribe, and check out the other interviews at www.popthehistorymakers.com. Now, to the interview with Lee Swillingham. So, Lee Swillingham, welcome. When I start these interviews, I often talk about the childhood because it has such a great impact on people's lives. And your mum was a graphic designer. What did your father do?
My dad was nothing to do with the arts. He was basically a businessman, but we grew up in Manchester. My mum and dad grew up in Manchester, and my dad and mum used to hang out on the kind of club scene in Manchester. So which kind of is the culture, really. So my dad knew George Best from Manchester United. They'd go and see all the bands, play the clubs in Manchester. Top of the Pops started in Manchester. So my mum and dad would go and see the Top of the Pops shows. They saw the Stones, they saw the Beatles. I'm drinking from my Hacienda. I've got my tea in my Hacienda mug.
I used to go there in the 80s, drive up from London.
Yeah.
Did your mother have a direct influence, apart from sort of the circle they were in, but did she have a direct influence in terms of sort of showing you her work and you getting interested in some way?
I think it was more that when my mum realized I was kind of good at art, right? Because that's what happens at school. Oh, Lee's good at art. She just like the encouragement was just unlimited. She would take me to kind of outside of school art clubs where I kind of could practice. She took me to the kind of museums in Manchester to see everything. The Natural History Museum in Manchester. I went to an art club there as well. Just like encouraged me. It kind of introduced me to magazines. Because my mum was a designer, she had lots of old magazines. I discovered this amazing magazine called Nova through my mum, which was kind of almost like ID or the Face of the 60s. Helmut Newton used to photograph for it. It was an incredible magazine. The book of Nova came out in the late 90s, and all the designers that bought that book kind of their minds were blown. Actually, it's such an incredible book. So it was more encouragement that way, I would say. My mum stopped working when she had the kids, as was kind of pretty normal for that generation. But the encouragement was definitely there.
What about, you mentioned going to museums, you mentioned this magazine that your mum had, Nova, but in terms of sort of the aesthetic of the world, of pop culture, of people in the streets in Manchester, what caught your eye and why?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think, I mean, Manchester, what it was an incredible place to grow up, especially in the mid to late 80s, when that was when I was 16, 17, 18 and starting to go to stuff. It was, culturally, I just felt it was kind of the UK's kind of second capital. And there's just kind of so much going on. It was we had Factory Records, we had the Hacienda nightclub, we had all those bands. We didn't just have one record label, there's probably like four. I mean, it's kind of crazy for such a small town to kind of have the ambition of a London. I mean, Tony Wilson really, really was so important to the kind of cultural growth of the pop cultural growth of Manchester. And the kind of the older I get, the more I realize what an important guy he was. Because when he was around, you'd see him at the Hacienda, or you'd see him walking down the street, and you go, "Oh, that's that bloke who presents the news, but also somehow seems to own the Hacienda." It was such a strange combination of kind of career choices. Um, Subsequently, obviously, you learn how that all came about, but you kind of don't think at the time, do you, that these people are going to go down as kind of being legends, and yeah, so it was such an inspiring place that the clubs, especially the Hacienda, had so many interesting nights. They had like fashion nights where they'd put on fashion shows. Magazines from London, like ID, would come to the Hacienda to do events, which, back then was a real kind of stamp of approval and honor to have like a London magazine come and do an event at your kind of club in Manchester. It's just hard to describe how inspirational it was to be there. In fact, I have to say, when I moved to London to go to St. Martin's, which was early 90s, 92, I guess, 91 perhaps. The recession was really kicking in the UK. I don't know if you kind of remember that or where you were at that time. So there was a bit of a slump generally. So I'd finally got to a St. Martin's, and it just seemed all kind of quite depressed, the whole kind of environment. The clubs weren't as exciting, and it was kind of strange that it wasn't as good as Manchester. That was partly to do with the timing and the recession kicking in, but it really did kind of take a couple of years for London to pick up again, I felt back then.
I mean, okay, I'm going to go back to Manchester because when you were, around about 13, I was 13 in, God, 72 or something like that.
Mm,
And for me, my introduction to pop culture was Bowie.
of course.
And I mean, like every gay kid of that generation,
Right, yeah.
that for me was such an important figure because it gave me a sense of belonging.
Mm.
And I just wondered whether there was an artist that gave you a sense of belonging, in the sense that this is where you wanted to be in your life, or it was these magazines that gave you a sense of belonging.
Well, I think it was everything. It was both, because we were, my generation was lucky. We're obviously pre-internet generation, but we're lucky to have all the children of Bowie. So by the time I was getting into music, it was Duran Duran, and I think I mean, I can't do the maths, but I remember Planet Earth coming out, seeing that incredible video I mean, it looks quite basic today, but back then it looked like they're on some space age mountain in space performing their song, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. The kind of combination of disco and rock, which I'd never heard before, but the more you learn about music, you kind of realize where they, borrowed that idea from, the bands they borrowed that from. And the bands around them, Spandau Ballet, I liked. So it was, and I also really liked the more rocky stuff. So I really loved. Talk of Bowie, I discovered Bowie through Bauhaus when they did Ziggy Stardust. That's how I discovered Bowie. And so I loved all those kind of dark gothic rock bands as well, like Bauhaus and Echo and the Bunnymen. And the magazines I got into music much before magazines. I got into music when I was like 11. I got into magazines when I was like 15 or 16, and I started buying The Face and ID. So it was probably music and magazines, and then also just cinema, just random, like random French cinema, catching a film noir on Channel 4 at midnight, all those kind of different things kind of coalescing. Um,
I mean, you
um,
mentioned you mentioned the pop video there, and the impression that made on you. It's sort of hard to understand for people today, I think. I mean, I remember going to a club in the early 80s and they would stop the music. And it was a trendy club, it was where all the sort of cool gay crowd of London would go. And they would stop the music and show a pop video that had just come out.
right, right. Well, yes, I remember the excitement around new videos coming out. And I remember staying up to midnight to watch Channel 4 premiere Thriller. That was a tube special, I remember. Uh, uh, and yes, there were big excitement around new Frankie Goes to Hollywood videos. I don't know if you remember that. Godley and Cream, I think, did Planet Earth, and they did those Frankie Goes to Hollywood videos. I mean, I love cinema, and cinema's been the main influence on my work today and my magazine work. So, um, I probably discovered film noir through watching Vienna by Ultravox, and then realizing afterwards, oh, they've copied those old movies. So it's that kind of education you get from channel hopping, watching your favorite music and TV shows. I think those bands, the way they mixed image and music it was such an kind of incredible thing. And I know they kind of got that from Brian Ferry and David Bowie, but they took it to a next level, really, didn't they? Because they started collaborating with people like Godley and Cream and other video directors, and the stuff was inspirational. No, it's very hard to explain how exciting it was, to get a new song and a video. Yeah, it's kind of impossible to. I don't know what the equivalent today is, to be honest. I can't think of something.
I read a really, what I thought was a really fascinating quote for you in an interview, and it read, "I'm already on to the next thing before I'm finished what I'm doing right now. That's just the way my mind works." When was that attitude formed? Was it formed early on?
Yes, and in a way, that's not always a good thing, but magazines were a good place for me to work because they have incredibly kind of tight deadlines, and you do have to kind of finish them. And there's an amazing there's a quote I love by John Ford, the director that did all those westerns, and he said, "Films are never finished; they're abandoned." And there's nothing better than a deadline, is there, to get things done? And the idea of endlessly tweaking and fiddling with stuff, really does not appeal to me. And when I read that certain artists still work on their records after they've uploaded them to iTunes and to Apple Music and Spotify, that just blows my mind. I'm a bit like, you just got to get this thing done and move on. I just love moving on. I'm not very nostalgic. I think almost nostalgia is kind of an illness to a certain extent because you can kind of cocoon yourself in the past and not live in the present. And you kind of see that happening a lot nowadays. But there's nothing wrong with looking back and figuring out why you enjoyed stuff when you were younger.
Well, I think also the issue of looking back is, in a sense, a new idea are two old ideas put together in a different
Oh
way, aren't
yeah.
they? So,
Yeah.
essentially, and I don't, that doesn't connect to nostalgia. That connects to actually understanding where you can get a new idea from.
Yes, I agree. I've got no problems with remixing old stuff at all. I love the idea of remixing and the famous quote which about stealing, the best artists steal. There's nothing wrong with all the bands I liked growing up, whether it was Bauhaus or Duran Duran, were stealing left, right, and center. I just didn't realize it at the time. Just like I can look at modern artists today and go, that sounds really like a song I remember from like 1989, like really similar. I'm sure you hear music all the time, which just sounds almost exactly like an old track. I mean, they've even got a word for it, haven't they, now, for interpolation or something, to
Yeah.
like how close you can get to an old song without getting sued, you know. Yeah, it's I like making new work, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And in my industry, which is now more kind of branding and advertising for fashion, it is all about making new work all the time. So that's what I really enjoy.
I mean, you came down to London, you mentioned at 17, you went to St Martin's College. Did you know that you wanted to be a creative director? You knew where you wanted to go before you started college, or was it something that came during those years?
I think by the time I'd got into St. Well, yeah, I went on the graphics course because I knew I wanted to do something to do with art direction or graphic design. I thought about illustration or fashion design um, while I was doing my foundation course, which is that 1 year course you do in the UK before you do your degree course. Um, and I chose or filmmaking, and then I chose graphic design because it struck me back then, especially with magazines, graphic design encompassed all sorts of different things like working with illustrators, photography, art direction of shoots, fashion. So it seemed like a good way to kind of do a little bit of everything. When I actually got to St. Martin's and met the people on the fashion course who were like amazing, I was like, oh yeah, I made the right choice. I'm not like these people, you know. I'm definitely doing the right thing, you know. So, yeah. So I kind of knew I wanted to do magazines or design. I was really inspired by the work of Neville Brody, who was the face art director in the 80s. The way he combined very strong, distinctive, custom-made graphic design with really interesting cropping of photography. That's he was my main kind of influence, kind of growing up. Um, and I met him for the first time a couple of weeks ago, at the opening of the National Portrait Gallery show I worked on about the face. And it was kind of funny to meet him after all these years. I think he was a little bit like kind of almost didn't believe me when I said, no, you were the reason why I got into this whole thing. And he was like, because obviously now I'm established and I've kind of got my own thing going on. But yeah, I mean, often people say, oh, coming from Manchester, were you inspired by um, Factory Records and all that thing? And actually, I did love the music from Factory Records, but there was so much music going on, and I only really liked a few artists from Factory Records. New Order and the kind of obvious ones. Because I liked other bands like the Cocteau Twins who were on 4AD or the Pixies, and there's a lot of choice back then for interesting and strong music, and also the art direction of all. There was amazing art directors working in music back then. You had Keith Breeden that did all the Scritti Politti stuff, which just looked like the most luxury fashion packaging of all time. Peter Saville, obviously, abstract kind of very well curated images with very little actual graphic design. And Malcolm Garrett, who I love, his Rio record sleeve is one of the key influential things of my youth, seeing that record sleeve and kind of understanding he was using the codes of kind of fashion illustration, putting it with music. Yeah, all those things kind of key influences on me, really. And why and kind of, yeah, I guess it's really obvious which way I was going to go when I talk about the things I liked when I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because going to St Martin's, I mean, there were people that came out of St Martin's like Jarvis Cocker, John Galliano,
Yeah.
Paloma Faith, Gilbert and George, PJ Harvey, Stephen Jones, Alexander McQueen, Joe Wright.
Yeah.
There was such a sort of diverse
Yeah.
mixture of people that came out of there, and there were so many numerous success stories. And I wonder if you go to a college that has that sort of success, it almost impels you to be different and be successful.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. I mean, I gave a rather fatuous quote a few years ago to a magazine, or someone was interviewing me saying, like, you don't go to St. Martin's to have a career in art. You go to St. Martin's to have a career in, pop music or something else. You know what I mean? It was almost like it was a place to be as opposed to what you did there. But that's not entirely true, because a lot of incredibly talented people in fashion and graphic design did come from there. I mean, when I was there, Jarvis was there. He was a few years above me. They had like what they used to call film and video, which is funny to think that was a course, but that was a course that he was on. I'm pretty sure I was the only person there that knew he was once in a band called Pulp, because that was the hiatus between the original iteration of Pulp from the 80s and when they came back with new band members in the 90s. So that was when he was kind of on his hiatus, really. So being such a music fan back then, I kind of knew I knew he was once in this band called Pulp.
Did you have a mentor at that school? Did you ever, someone like, I don't know, professor, teacher, or whatever they're called, and they gave you a piece of advice that stuck with you?
No, not really. I mean, my art teacher was great in as much as recognized um he recognized I had skill in drawing and painting, but I think more than that, he recognized I was into things, So I remember he indulged me and allowed me to paint like on a kind of 5 foot, 6 foot high canvas, a kind of Roy Lichtenstein film noir kind of image. That wasn't so much about me wanting to be a fine artist. I think that was him recognizing, oh, Lee understands the codes of pop art, the codes of illustration, and he's like creating. I think that's what I was doing then. I mean, I don't know, I was 17, but so I think he kind of I remember him acknowledging he was called Tim. This I can't remember his surname, but he was a great art teacher. And he was just acknowledging, oh, you like pop art, you like Warhol, you like, um, you like, this kind of aesthetic, Liechtenstein, but I don't think he thought I was going to be a painter. I don't think I was going to be a painter. I was just trying to express the stuff I was into, and you kind of learn about Warhol. I learned about it from my mum or from looking at books, but you also learn about it when you read interviews with like Green Garson from Scritti Politti or uh, Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran used to talk about art a lot. And I'd go, oh, that's interesting. Who's that? Or I loved Japan, who never had much success, but I loved their music. And
Tomorrow's Parties, David Sylvian. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was another big influence, so I wasn't, it's interesting, isn't it, that from that era of musicians, it wasn't just about the music, but it was about like the stuff they were into. I don't think you could have said that about the generation before, and I'm not sure you could even say about the generation after, but it was the art school crowd, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, although in the 60s, a lot of the stars that came out of the 60s, they had been to art school as well. So I think there was,
That's
and also,
correct.
and you've got Godley and Cream of another generation who are at art
Yeah.
school. So there, I think art school has played an enormous
Oh, no,
role in pop
absolutely.
culture.
No, I
Yeah.
was talking from my experience
Oh, right.
onwards, from the 80s onwards. But you're absolutely right. I'm obviously historically now I understand, pretty much as much as anyone would want to know about all that stuff now. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
You worked at the Face in a different position and sort of worked your way up, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well,
how
yeah.
did you become art director?
So basically, I this is it's kind of a funny story. I got an introduction to um uh, an art director through someone in Manchester. I got an introduction to people at the Face magazine while I was still at St. Martin's. So I suppose I was like second year St. Martin's, and I kind of badgered them a bit, and they allowed me to come in and assist on Arena magazine, which was the men's magazine published in parallel to the Face. And Arena magazine only came out every other month or 6 times a year. So it allowed me to be at art school, be at college, do some work, and then Arena came around. So I'd like disappear over to the Arena office for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And just when my tutors were starting to think, Lee's not been in for about 2 weeks, I'd appear again. And because it wasn't every month, there'd be like a 2 month gap, and then I'd disappear again. So they just never realized. Well, they did realize towards the end what I was doing. Someone grassed me up what I was doing to the tutors, and I got a letter in in your little cubby hole you had that said, because apparently you've been doing this, that's not allowed. So it was towards, by then it was towards, I think, the end of my third year. So it was kind of a bit of a moot point. But that's kind of how I got in. And then when I left St. Martin's, I was offered an assisting job between both the magazines, between the Face and Arena, because it was a assisting job. I just did different things on both the magazines. Um, and the guy I was assisting at the Face, he was new, the art director, and um, I think he left after about 18 months. Uh, and at that point, I thought, oh, well, my number's up here. You know, the art director's leaving. It's time to actually get a job somewhere else in design, because they, you know, when they appoint a new art director, that guy will bring in his own team. But Cheryl Garrett, the editor at the time, and Nick Logan, the owner, asked me if I wanted to do it. They called me in. Nick called me into his office and asked me if I wanted to be the art director. And I mean, I literally, you know, I just couldn't believe they were asking me to do it. I was like 22. Yeah, subsequently I've realized they'd sussed out that I'd already in the time I'd been there as an assistant was making connections with photographers, kind of was bringing in new photographers to the section of the front of the magazine where you tried out new people. So I think they just thought this guy's gonna be able to do it. And I interviewed Nick for the catalogue for the exhibition, and I kind of asked him that question, why did you do it? But we kind of like came up with this concept of, there's almost this idea back then of, if you know, you know, if you understand the culture of the Face or ID and that world of art, music, nightclubs, intersection, if you understand that, and then you're the right person to work at the Face. And that's kind of what Nick was very good at, recruiting and understanding the right people to work on his magazine. It's kind of like a part of his genius, really, was knowing the right people to put on the cover, to work on the magazine, to write for the magazine. So I actually, looking back, was probably quite a safe bet. It was just hard to realize that at the time.
I mean, I'm going to get onto the sort of changes of aesthetic of the
Yeah.
Face that you brought in, but
Oh, yeah.
did you also challenge the way of working? More of Lee in a moment, talking about the Face and that culture shift exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in London. Subscribe, like, and check out the other interviews at popthehistorymakers.com.
It was more of a challenge. It was more that the challenge was to work. You know, it was a bit overwhelming for a 22-year-old to suddenly have all that work to do. And you know, I think just keeping your head, to be completely honest, just keeping your head above water was all we could do. And I brought in my colleague Stuart Spalding, who I'd known since art school, who I still work with today. So he became, I think it's called the art editor, who worked with me, and then we put a little team together. You know, I think back then, grand ideas of challenging the status quo, doing things differently, it just didn't exist as a concept. You know, you kind of were day to day trying to get this thing done, but also wanting to do a really amazing job. I mean, I was slightly intimidated by the amazing legacy of the magazine, the you know, the Felix Howard covered where it says hard and he's got killer, and you know, the Ray Petrie Jake. I mean, that's the best magazine cover of all time, in my opinion. And it's kind of intimidating to have that. You know, they had all the back issues in the office, and like you'd look at it and go, oh my God, just, you know, let me get on with it. It's intimidating to see that stuff, you know. So it took a year or two to get into the swing of things. And then I did start challenging how to do things, not least encouraging designing the magazine on the computer, which I'd learned to do at college, but the magazine actually wasn't doing itself.
So what did you change about the aesthetic, and also talk about, you know, the technological aspect that you just mentioned, that designing it on the computer, and what that enabled you to do?
Well, really, my generation was already familiar with doing graphic design on the Macintosh. We were lucky that good art schools had Macintosh computers then, so you'd kind of learn how to do that. And I love technology, so you know, I jumped on the opportunity to use the Mac. You know, I think it was one or two Macs at St. Martin's. Andrew Whittle, who was an amazing tutor at St. Martin's, realized that and got me on the Mac. And it was, I remember, you know, it was a formative experience. My first time using a Mac is still, imprinted on my memory. It's like the first time I heard, uh, you know, uh, Billie Jean by Michael Jackson blew my mind. These kind of formative memories. I should have been remembering other stuff, but that's what I remember, using the mouse and like moving things around on a screen. And Nick was very keen to bring in what was called DTP then, desktop publishing. So that's something that happened, and that kind of really freed up. Basically, it allowed you to design quickly, and once you could design the pages quicker, then you could focus on other things like the photography or doing more ambitious layouts. And there was a certain style of photography in the magazine I'd taken over from the previous art director, who did a great job. But it kind of wasn't really what I was into. There's a lot of kind of more classic black and white photography. It was very much it's almost like a New York style you see in American magazines, of gray studio backgrounds, very clean. I had no interest in that at all. I'd kind of connected with a bunch of new younger photographers in London, and I just started kind of working with those guys, and very quickly we were just kind of like discovering new ways of working. And along with that, I kind of wanted to make things a bit more glamorous again. I loved like the Roxy Music album covers, or the Hypnosis, the 10cc or Led Zeppelin album covers, ambitious art directed images of people doing strange, interesting things. Like I never remember which album is which, but the one where they're sitting around the table with a strange thing on the table, and the strange sculpture on the table.
But it's funny that you sort of cite these things when you said that good pop culture has a disposable strand to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you marry those two things?
I suppose because in the end, I don't think it's art. I all these things I love, I don't think it's art. Art moves you, and I love art. I particularly love the German expressionists or the vorticists. Some of the YBAs from the 90s. I don't think that stuff is art. I don't think record sleeves are art. I think they're commercial art. I think there's something very different. I mean, I think there's something nice about being disposable. I mean, isn't pop music disposable, really? I mean, it's hung around for years, but it was designed to be disposable, wasn't it? And I like the idea of, I mean, that's why I like pop art, I suppose, because it's kind of disposable. I'm sure Warhol didn't think his stuff will be hanging around in 100 years' time, but there's kind of inbuilt obsolescence, which I think is fun, because you're doing something for the moment and then you're moving on to something else.
I mean, you've mentioned, sort of a lot of things which have had impact on you and into your creativity. But from your time at the Face and what you achieved there, can you give me an example of how you may have influenced popular culture yourself, or specific people even?
I think I know this from what people tell me, but I think when I changed the whole look and feel and art direction of the Face towards this more glamorous, post-grunge, colorful aesthetic, and started working with photographers like Norbert Schöner, who I'd just done the show with, or Inez van Lamswoord, or Andrea Giacobbe, and we were creating it. It moved from photography to image making, because taking the pictures just the start, then you go on the system, Quantel, or whatever computer system you had, and then you start changing the colors and adding things and taking them away. I mean, that was very fresh and new at the time. It kind of repelled and upset some people, but many other people loved it, and it kind of took off quite quickly within the culture. I think Nick Logan reminded me when we were talking that there was a Levi's advert from around that time which used that Spaceman track, which also hit the charts. Now that ad is completely lifted from a fashion story I did with Andrea Giacobbe, where we art directed and created this shoot together. And we were basically making storyboards for Levi's, who then, you know, a few months later, and there were a lot of things like that. But this is no different from what happened to Neville Brody when everyone copied his typography, or other art directors. We Stuart and myself will change the design of the magazine like every 18 months, and we introduced this kind of quite tough industrial look, which used kind of stencil typography, so slightly military, slightly industrial. And we had to design these fonts ourselves because you couldn't buy these kind of military inspired stencil fonts for the computer, for the Mac. They didn't exist. So we drew them out. And, you know, within a year, the Train Spotting graphic design and marketing material all looked exactly like that, you know, and many, you know, those fonts, that kind of graphic design and typographic approach became like a massive thing that everyone copied. But, you know, in a way, the face was there to be copied. That's kind of almost what the point of it was, you know. It's
well,
like,
it was a sort of an exchange, wasn't it?
yes.
I always felt there was an exchange between me as a reader and the magazine. And the magazine was sort of a leader and a reflection of the culture at the same time.
I think that's a good way. I think that's a really good way of putting it. It's yes, it's both of those things, because you have to reflect the culture, you have to see what's going on, but you also want to show people what's new as well. And I think that's kind of the job of the magazine. And I think visually it was my job to do something new and interesting. It had to be as good or as interesting as what had come before. And yeah, these things we did, these shoots we did, or these designs we did, kept getting copied. Sometimes this is why I started my own agency, actually, because sometimes someone would come to you, a brand or someone, and say, you know, we like what you did for that. Can you do that for our project? You know, I mean, basically that's what Tom Ford, when he was at Gucci, did. He literally called me or faxed me and asked me to do something based on something he'd seen in the magazine. Other people in the States asked us to do projects, and that's kind of how we started our own agency, through people coming to us and asked us to work on stuff, which we barely had any time to do. Our first love was the magazine. So I think there's a lot of things that people copied. We did this fun project when Tomb Raider was the really big video game when it first came out, and I had the idea to do a fashion shoot with Lara Croft. Obviously, Lara's not a real person, so we went to Core, which was, still remember that name, the design company that essentially owned Tomb Raider and the copyright to Lara Croft, and we sent them outfits, and they were designed. Excuse me, they rendered Lara on the computer in the outfits, and we got them from McQueen, from Gucci, all these brands. And, you know, I think that was the first time it was like a virtual person wore clothes, like a virtual fashion shoot. And it was so ahead of its time that it wasn't until you really only started seeing this stuff in the last 5 years, with excitement about the metaverse and Web3 and avatars, that whole thing that was around. It was kind of interesting to do that. A lot of people wanted to use those Lara Croft images. All the international copyists of the face that existed in like Germany and France and all those magazines that used to exist, that they'd call up and say, can we use those pictures, you know? So yeah, there were kind of lots of things we did that kind of got reused or copied.
I mean, it's interesting to use to talk about Lara Croft, because obviously a film has a narrative. Does a layout also have a narrative, or is it just images?
For me, they do. When I think putting together a fashion story for a layout in a magazine does have a narrative, for sure. It's about telling a story, even if those individual images don't kind of go from A to C or whatever. I think a good layout does tell some kind of story. And some of the shoots we did an amazing shoot with Sean Ellis, photographer Sean Ellis, with it was kind of based on Excalibur, the old John Borman movie. and Sean and Isabella Blow actually got the armor from that movie, and there was Jeremy Scott and Alexander McQueen dressed up in the armor, Erin O'Connor. It's an amazing shoot, actually. And when those pictures came in, I said to Sean and Izzy, who sadly is no longer with us, these pictures are amazing because they're really classic looking, except there's like a weird darkness to them. And obviously they're featuring contemporary people like Alexander McQueen. And I said, they'll probably be in the National Portrait Gallery one day. And I was kind of joking because there couldn't have been anything further from working at the face to the National Portrait Gallery. I mean, that was literally square conservatism, you know what I mean? And yet here we are all these years later, and those pictures are on the wall in the National Portrait Gallery. So I have no idea what that says about culture and time and history. Maybe you can figure that one out.
I mean, mentioning that, because I believe you co-curated that, the Face magazine Culture Shift, this exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. How did your view of your contribution to culture change through, reviewing, in a sense, your time at the Face to actually make this exhibition?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the idea to have that exhibition was kind of back of an envelope in the pub idea I had with Norbert Schöner, who is a photographer. I did a lot of those hyper-real, colourful images with back in the day. He did that amazing Kylie Minogue one where she's wearing the blue sweater and then she's got the blonde hair. We had a much more modest concept, which was, why has no one done an exhibition on the photography from the Face? You and I worked for it. I was the art director, you was the photographer. We know the stuff's amazing. The stuff we did was great. The stuff that Mondino and Stefan Sidney said is incredible. Why? It's just a no-brainer. We just couldn't understand it. So we just wanted to put a small private show on based around the stuff we liked. Someone suggested us that maybe we go and see a few museums and galleries. So we put a little deck together and went to see the National Portrait Gallery. I knew one of the curators there. And we say, we've got this idea. We want to do a show on the Face, probably quite a focused small thing, but there's some like really amazing pictures that need to be seen again. And then less than a week later, they called up and said, we want to do the show. So we were like, Norbert and I were like, we didn't even expect that to happen. So all of a sudden we had this small, gallery thing. We had this idea, I have to be honest with you, we were more thinking about the party we were going to have. If we do an amazing show, think of the amazing party we can do. So
that thinking ahead.
Yeah, well, also shows the generation we're from, right?
Yeah.
So the rave generation, yeah.
So to the point of your contribution.
Yeah. Well, I don't look back that much, and I hadn't looked at those shoots for many years. And to curate the exhibition with Norbert and Sabina, who's the in-house curator of the gallery, we had to look through every issue. And I knew most of the stuff, but I was pleased how it stood the test of time. And I think kind of culturally, it kind of connects and reflects the era quite well in the way the previous generation, like the Buffalo pictures by Jamie Morgan, I think the pictures of Suede, I was really pleased to see how the shoot we did with Brett Anderson, when it was all painted over in the Quantel paint back by Inez Van Lanswood, it really did bring back memories of that kind of decadent glamour that Suede had. So I think generally we're kind of just really pleased. I mean, I don't feel I own it. I didn't have any problem if there was loads of that stuff in. And similarly, if other people said, no, Lee, I hate that, I didn't have a problem with it not being in. I felt I was working for Nick Logan, who's this, publishing genius, and anything to get Nick's name out there and the Face back, the original Face back in the memory of the public imagination was an important thing to do. The stories came flooding back. That's the thing. The stories like the crazy Robbie Williams shoot.
Tell me.
Well, I'm you kind of know the music I'm into, so you won't be surprised to know I'm not really a fan of Robbie's music, but the guy was just had so much energy, and we did this shoot with him more or less just after Let's Take That, and I'd kind of forgotten all this, but it was a big deal in the UK that he'd left Take That. No one had heard any new music yet. His first interview since leaving the band was with The Face. We commissioned this amazing gothic black and white photo shoot. I asked Norman Watson to photograph it. Judy Blame did the styling. We had like handcuffs and leather things and whips and all sorts of stuff. And we shot in this like big second or third floor photo studio on Clockwell Road, which is a very busy road in London. And one end of the studio's got this glass window that looks out onto the street. And while Robbie was in the changing room between shots, I just wandered over to the window to have a look, and I saw like a crowd was amassing on the street. So they'd somehow heard someone had leaked that Robbie was being photographed. So I was just kind of quite interested, because not really being a kind of following kind of that kind of pop music myself. I was just amazed about all the kids on the street, mainly girls, obviously, but loads of kids on the street. So I wandered back to see how Robbie and Judy were getting on, changing. And I went in the changing room. Robbie was just like sitting there in his like white underwear, having a cigarette. They were really behind, and I said, "Oh, Robbie, I've just looked out. There's like loads of kids on the street, like all shouting and like saying Robbie, Robbie, Robbie." And he looked up at me and didn't say a word. Like he sprung out of his chair and like darted like Roadrunner across
In his
the
underwear.
studio floor and threw himself like Jesus against the glass window, splayed in his underwear. And it was kind of one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen on a photo shoot. And the kids on the street just went insane, and I was just like, oh my God, this is like the Beatles, or this is like, Duran Duran or Wham, or, I was like, this is kind of incredible. And like, I was never a fan of his music, but I was such a fan at that point about his kind of charisma and his showmanship is just like insane. And, and the comedic value. The guy's super funny and could have been a comedian, You've probably met him more times than me. I've only met him a couple of times, but it was all new to me, not following any of his career and seeing him just, kind of. I was more used to working with like rock bands or who would just sit on the sofa smoking cigarettes, waiting for the photographer to call them, and he was just like up for it. And the shoot is amazing. And looking back at that shoot, I really do love that shoot, and it's in the exhibition. It's a great shot. I think it's the cover picture or something similar to the cover picture. Um, yeah. So yeah, that was interesting. That was interesting, and I do want to see that movie. Actually, I want to see that movie he made, because, again, I kind of ignored that movie, and then I watched on YouTube. They did one of the songs is on YouTube, and it's the monkey character in central London running around, and there's no cuts, and it's an amazing piece of technological filmmaking, and it's one of his quite good songs. I can't remember what the song is, so I kind of want to see that movie now. I think that movie looks really interesting.
I mean, one thing I've read about you is that you've been influenced by Alexei Brodovich,
Right.
and he was the art director of Harper's Bazaar from 34 to 48.
Yeah.
And he looked to Europe, bringing in French and German magazines into his classes as well that he gave, aside from his work there.
Yeah.
How were you looking at Europe at that time? Because you only mentioned that magazines in Europe would call you up and say, can we have this photo or whatever? But were you looking to Europe at that time for any influences?
No, that's an interesting question. No, I think I was interested in French and Italian fashion magazines because they were fantastic. Like Italian Vogue, one of the best fashion magazines of all time. I started collecting that when I was still at St. Martin's. Stephen Meisel would do all the covers, and Franca Zazani was the editor, and they're like incredible. Peter Lindbergh, Stephen Meisel. There were interesting French magazines, but no, apart from that, not really. Though, I'm a Europhile, and I used to love going to Paris when I was a kid and going to all the, and I loved Jean-Paul Gaultier, the fashion designer. I love John Paul Good, the photographer who did all the Grace Jones album sleeves. But no, not so much then. There was a lot going on in the UK. There was Brit pop, there was the Brit art thing, and my main influences are British, I would say. Um, this country's produced incredible musicians and artists, and yeah, in that respect, not really.
I just want to get back to Alexei Brodovich because he had a phrase that he used to say to people, which was "astonish me."
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, is
Yeah,
that part of your thinking?
I think so. You know, I would say things to photographers like, let's push it, let's push it. And then I was certainly looking for people that were pushing things and doing something new. When I first met Inez van Lanswoord and Vinod Matadan that did those um the pictures where they'd photograph the models in the studio and then they superimposed them against stock photography. So you've got the girls on the bicycles and then you've got the rocket ships going off into in the background. You know, I was looking for things like that to just I guess I was looking to push the imagery in the magazine, be more transgressive, get reactions from people, you know, shock people. I didn't want to offend people. I didn't have any interest in that, but it's good to push people's buttons. And I think that was the job of the face, really, to do that. I love Brodovich's graphic design. You know, I mean, he was European emigre, wasn't he, that moved to
Yeah.
the States, you know, and he imported that kind of sophisticated European typography into America. And he obviously had a long-standing relationship with Richard Avedon, who's one of the best photographers of all time. Um, yeah, I think Brodovich is up there with my graphic design influences, but I think every magazine designer that likes elegant, strong typography is somehow influenced by Alexei Brodovich because literally everything comes from Alexei Brodovich. Everything comes from him. You know, if in your local town, if your Italian restaurant has a fancy logo in a in a specific Dido or Bodoni typeface, ultimately that's there because of Alexei Brodovich because he introduced a suite of fonts that influenced the whole world. So um, you know, design is interesting because people don't, it's not really like music. People don't really know unless you're a designer where things come from. You know, I think with music, more people would go, oh, well, that sounds a bit like the Beatles, or that sounds a bit like the Who, but people don't know that with design, but all design comes from somewhere as well.
You mentioned Stuart Spalding and that he was at St. Martin's with you and you have a company together, Suburbia. And you also talked about the face pushing boundaries. But when you have your own company, um, how difficult is it to push boundaries when you're doing work for a client who ultimately will make the decision and pay your
Yeah.
rent, as it were?
Well, that's a good one. I actually met Stuart on my art foundation course in Manchester. He didn't go to St. Martin's, but when I got the job at the Face, I called him and said, I can't actually believe this, but they've given me the Face. I need help. Will you come and help me? So, you know, we reconnected, and he joined me at the Face magazine. I think regarding clients, I think when I was kind of younger and started working with clients like fashion brands that wanted me to kind of art direct their advertising, I had the mistaken idea that they wanted me to push things as far as they'd seen in the magazine. And I learned pretty quickly that they absolutely don't. You know, they want the kind of more mainstream version of what they've seen. If you copy it exactly, it's just kind of too much for them. But I think kind of like working with clients is problem solving. It's, you know, it's you got to figure out what the commercial challenges are for what they need and come up with something you know, desirable, exciting, but it's kind of not your really job. It's not really your job to kind of like upset the client. You know, I think that's not really that's a bit more punk, I would say. That's not really today.
And in terms of celebrities and their impact they can have for your work, how has that changed over the years that you've been working? Are Is the celebrity icon more important today?
I think, yeah, I think you're right. I think to a certain extent, the idea of kind of celebrities having that kind of fallen commercial power is undoubtedly a driving force in kind of marketing and advertising. There was a kind of coalescence, wasn't there, between kind of the fashion industries and the music industries that happened in the 2000s. And, fast forward to today, and all the musicians go to the fashion shows, they're in the advertising campaigns. Some of them are now designers, like Pharrell Williams is actually a fashion designer now, whereas he started out as a musician. So, yeah, undoubtedly, the idea of the celebrity um, kind of bringing eyeballs and attention to brands is still a thing. I mean, I wonder if that will change. I wonder if people just get bored. I mean, I think there's almost a phenomenon now anyway of different levels of fame, because I think some people are more internet famous than famous. There's levels of fame now, isn't there? There's everything from influencers to YouTubers to musicians and actors who are kind of more internet known and maybe not known to people just on the street. So I guess it depends how all that's going to kind of change. And I mean, culture's definitely getting atomized, isn't it? There's lots of different things everywhere for culture. So um, I don't know if we'll ever go back to the days of this is the big movie, this is the big album of the year, this is the big, there seems to be too much stuff or content, which is a horrible word, right? But that's basically how everything is described now. So I think there's more stuff than ever before. I mean, I still love new music, but a lot of the stuff I listen to, you know, they don't have that many listeners on Spotify. And if I tell my friends, they're like, no, who's that? I don't know what you're talking about. And I sometimes think, God, if these guys were around 20 years ago, they'd be such a massive artist. But now they're just getting lost in the just the swamp, of content.
Yeah, I want to finally ask you a question that really revolves around in the times that we live, because we
Mm,
live in the era of Donald Trump.
mm,
We live in the era of the rise of the far right, of totalitarianism.
mm.
And I just wondered whether you feel the political sphere will affect yours and other people's work, and in what way?
Yeah, I think design and art direction is always affected by the culture and the politics, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. But I certainly don't hope. I certainly hope people don't start censoring themselves. I think that'd be like a really terrible thing. You kind of feel that might be happening now in America almost. How quiet the kind of Hollywood media is for this administration compared to the previous one is kind of quite interesting. Um, I guess they've probably just decided, this is the administration, they won the election, and we have to work with it. But I hope people don't start kind of censoring themselves. I think that'd be kind of terrible. And that would be, even though I'm not the punk rock generation, it would be very anti-ethical to the way I've always worked.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered whether it would actually create a movement um, against this type of authority.
You'd hope so. You'd hope so. I wouldn't say we're living in a moment where pop culture seems very political, really. I don't know what you think about that, but for me, I don't see that so much. It's almost seems to be slightly unfashionable to be associated with a political point of view right now as a artist. And I think there's always publications, designers, musicians, whatever, making work, and some of them are more political, but it's certainly not, you're not seeing those big political movements you used to see in music previously. Um, I mean, there's a lot of satire there's a certain amount of satire going on in cinema, if you watch Triangle of Sadness, I think there's a lot of contemporary comments in that movie. I quite like that movie. And I like his other movies. I think, he did a good one on the art world. So there's that going on. That's more satire, I suppose. But I think if there is an ever-increasing drive towards totalitarianism, people will step up. I think it's human nature.
Well, Lee Swillingham, thank you. I mean, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And in the end, I really want to thank you as well for your contribution, because it's an important contribution to popular culture. And I think that exhibition, the Face exhibition, which is at the National Portrait Gallery, has really shown that by the fact that so many people have visited.
Yeah. No, it's going well. It's on till the 18th of May, I think, and it's worth coming to London to see, for sure.
Brilliantly. Thanks again.
Thanks, Steve.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.